Welcome back to The Art of Plenty. I'm Amy McInnes, and today we are talking about intimacy in intimate relationships. Stay tuned because I've got a 24-hour sex challenge for you, and we're going to dive into sex and how to make your sex satisfying, even if you've been married for a long time, and even if you've gone through a lot of changes in your own body and in your relationship. And kiddos, if you're listening, this is not the episode for you. We are talking about intimacy in adult relationships. I got to preface this by saying I hardly ever talk about my sexual relationship with my husband with anybody other than my husband. I could maybe count on one hand how many times I've done that. And the reason for that for me is because I think of sex as something that's very intimate and almost sacred. And because it's so intimate and because it's between two people and only two people, my husband's the only person I have sex with, it is a way that I'm able to protect my relationship and protect my intimacy by not talking about it. But here's the deal. Sometimes we don't know if we're okay if we're not talking about things, if we don't hear other people's stories. Sometimes the information that we get through online media doesn't provide an accurate picture of what real relationships look like and what sex looks like in real relationships. And I remember a friend of mine, it was actually right around the first time where we started being friends and where I actually started to get to know her. And she was adamant about talking about her personal experience. So when she was pregnant, her pelvic floor tightened up. And I'm sure there's a word for it, but I'm not a physiotherapist. And everything got so tight that sex was incredibly painful for her. And she went through a lot of physiotherapy with a pelvic floor specialist in order to fix and repair her pelvic floor and therefore impact and change her sexual relationship. And she was so incredibly open about talking about her personal experience because she did not want other women to suffer. And she thought by sharing this, she could potentially prevent other people from suffering. And I absolutely adore that because it creates space for people to recognize that, maybe there isn't something quite right about my relationship. Or even on the other hand, maybe there's something validating about hearing other people's stories because you can feel like, we're actually doing great. This is a measure of how other people are doing. And I think about that. I heard this statistic yesterday, and it was talking about the number of idolized women's bodies that we see by the time we're 18. And it was bananas. I think it was 6 million images by the time we're 18 of idolized women's bodies. And the person that was talking about the stat said, you need to see real women's bodies, like in the swimming pool change room, to get a perspective of what it's really like, because we're so inundated with images that aren't necessarily real or realistic. And I think that the same thing can happen with intimate relationships and with sex, is we don't have a picture of what that actually looks like in a healthy relationship. There was a pastor, and I was in church, and I remember him saying that sex isn't easy. And I remember nothing else what he said, but that statement stood out to me because I thought it was ridiculous. I was like, what do you mean sex isn't easy? Like, what are you even talking about? You clearly don't know anything. And now that I've gone through 4 vaginal births, a cesarean, cancer treatments, hormone treatments, and just the ebbs and flows of a marriage that's more than 20 years old. I'm like, oh, that's what he was talking about. It's not easy because it's something that if you want to maintain, if you want to continue having a satisfying sexual relationship with your partner, it's something that you have to continually work on and put effort into and energy toward. And that's what makes it not easy, is you actually have to do something to keep it good. And that's not necessarily the case in an early relationship. There's a reason why we call the beginning of a relationship the honeymoon period. Sex is easier because you're thinking about it all the time and your body's thinking about it all the time. So we're going to talk about some of the things that I have learned along the way of being in a long-term relationship. So because I'm talking about personal experience, I'm talking about my relationship specifically with my husband. So a woman-man sexual relationship that is in a secure relationship like a marriage. That's the only experience that I can speak from. But the other part of this is a lot of the understanding that I have is based on research and is therefore applicable to other types of relationships, not just people that are in a marriage or people that are in a long-term relationship. So I just wanted to preface that because, again, I'm talking from my own experience, but there is some applicability to other types of relationships. So here are some of the things that I have learned. And the first thing I have learned is that intimacy and sex changes over the course of a relationship. And I alluded to this already by talking about the honeymoon period. But one of the most significant changes that happened in my own relationship was going through the process of having babies. And I remember the first time I had a baby, going back to see the doctor, and I had my 6-week checkup after she was born. And the doctor was like, oh, you're good to have sex now. No, I don't even know what that meant. Like, you're good to have sex again. Because first of all, that first 6 weeks, I was certainly not thinking about sex, which again is a hormonal piece, but I was absorbed with trying to physically heal and all of a sudden being responsible for this person. And what happened is my relationship, not just the sex part, but all aspects of my relationship got pushed to the side while we were focusing on this new person. And with every baby that came after that, it wasn't as prevalent, that push to the side piece, because I learned that you actually have to really focus on the relationship even when the babies come home, because that is a really crucial time and season that couples need to navigate in order that they don't end up in divorce. But it definitely got easier with more babies because I understood what my body was going to be doing and how my body needed to be healing. But that first time, I didn't even know that, like, this is going to sound ridiculous because it was a vaginal birth, but I didn't even think about, well, why wouldn't I be able to have sex, and what difference is it going to make? Like, I know it sounds completely naive, and it was, but I just didn't even think about it. It wasn't one of those things that came up for me. The other piece that can really impact and change your sex life is if you've gone through physical changes. If you've gained a lot of weight, if you've lost a lot of weight, if you're physically unwell, when things are off balance in your body, things are off balance in your body. And just because you have a sickness that isn't necessarily related to your sex drive, oftentimes if you have a physical ailment, it can impact your sex drive. And if you're on medications for different ailments, it can 100% affect your sex drive. Even things like yeast infections can impact the experience of sex. So one of the constants is that my sex life has changed over the course of my relationship. And along with that, so has there been changes in desire. And it's as though you have to keep continually learning about yourself and what it is that you like and what makes you feel loved. And the same goes for your partner. I've been talking primarily about my own changes, and perhaps it's because I think male changes are way less prevalent. In fact, it says typically for women that as they age, their difficulties or problems related to sex actually decrease over time, and that the only thing that women really struggle with later on has to do with lubrication. Like that's kind of the only issue, whereas when women are younger, there's typically more difficulties related to having sex. And I'm not really sure what that is related to, but men's experience can be a little bit more consistent. I think maybe primarily because they don't have babies. The second piece that I've learned along the way is the communication is key. And this is actually what relationship therapists know about sex lives, is that communication is directly connected to satisfaction. Now, I'm not a sex therapist, but as a marriage therapist, sex often comes up in conversations because how can it not? And one of the things that I've noticed with couples that I've worked with is there are couples that are extremely comfortable talking about their sex life with me and with each other. They have no problem. It's really evident that there's a lot of communication. But then on the other side of that, I have worked with couples who can hardly talk about it in the room and never talk about it as a couple, and never, prior to coming to therapy, had ever talked about their sex life. And I have to say, how do you even know what it is that your partner wants from you? Or how does your partner know what you want if you don't actually talk about it? Because yes, there are all sorts of other cues that communicate. We're not just communicative with our words. We communicate with our actions and obviously with sounds. But those things can be easily misinterpreted. Even words can be easily misinterpreted. So we can't assume that our partner knows just because they know us or they've been in relationship with us for a long time. And because we are constantly changing beings, sometimes we don't even know what we like or what we want. So how could we ever expect our partner to know what we like or what we want? And that's why we have to talk about it. So more than frequency, more than the type of orgasms or the frequency of orgasms, the thing that sets satisfying sexual relationships apart from unsatisfying sexual relationships is the communication about sex. And I'm not talking about that just primarily from personal experience. I'm also talking about that from a research perspective. Not that I've done the research, but I've read the research. The next piece that I've learned along the way is that sex is essential to healthy relationships. And again, I'm talking intimate adult relationships. Sex is an essential part. If nothing else, it's a way to come together when you're not always together. Because over the course of a relationship, there are a lot of times where there is a bit of a divide or division, or like I was saying earlier, when you have kids and you're busy, you aren't necessarily on the same page or going in the same direction all the time. And when that's happening, sex is a way to come together and get on the same page. And it's an easy way to do that because it doesn't require that you have to have the same opinions about things. It doesn't require that you have to be working on the same projects. You just have to come together. And there's no pun intended with that. Now, what I mean by that is that it's a way of actually putting aside the other things in life, whether it's work, whether it's stress, whether it's changes that are happening, whether it's grief, whether it's sadness. It's a way of putting that aside and taking care of one another, because intimacy is an act where you have an opportunity to care for your partner in a way that no one else does. No one else meets those needs if you're in a relationship like I'm talking about. And it's an opportunity to do that for your partner. And that is what makes that relationship healthy. It's a piece of it. Now, here's the deal. If you have a bad relationship, that can impact your sex life. And if you have a bad sex life, that can impact the quality of your relationship. And you can end up in this downward spiral because the relationship's bad, so therefore the sex is bad, which then makes the relationship worse, which then again makes the sex worse, and you can keep going down. It doesn't really matter what is the beginning piece, whether the beginning piece is that the sex is bad or the beginning piece is that the relationship is bad. You can sometimes solve aspects of a bad relationship by fixing your sex life, because it can start to change the trajectory of the relationship by focusing and working on sex. Now, if you have a good sex life, it's not necessarily going to make everything about your relationship good. I'm not suggesting that, because there's things that we have to work on in our relationships, not just our sex life, in order to have a healthy, strong, loving relationship. But an unsatisfactory sexual relationship can lead to alienation. It can lead to infidelity. It can lead to the relationship being more vulnerable for anger or detachment. And ultimately, unsatisfying sex lives can lead to divorce, which matters, especially when our divorce rates are as high as they are. And this is something that you can do by working on your sex life, is something that you can do to help change the course of your relationship. It can be a first step. Now, this piece is connected to research. That this is something I've learned along the way, and that is frequency doesn't matter. But there's a caveat to that, because when I say that, I mean frequency doesn't matter for whether or not a sex life is satisfying. And that means you don't have to be having sex a certain number of times to have your relationship be satisfying. However, you have to be having sex frequently enough that you and your partner are satisfied. You, as a couple, have to be satisfied with the frequency. And the reason why I say frequency doesn't matter is some people get worked up thinking about, well, how often should we be having sex? What is everybody else doing? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what other couples are doing. It matters what you're doing and whether or not you and your partner are feeling satisfied with the frequency. Now, people still often want numbers about what is normal. So based on statistics that are from a few years ago out of the States, 10 times a year is considered sexless, like a sexless relationship. Some people have sex less than that are in long-term relationships. That's not a marker necessarily of a healthy relationship or a satisfied relationship. What's more typical is once a week, with younger couples maybe a bit more frequent and older couples landing more close towards the once a week. But for many couples, that might not be satisfying. And for many couples, that might feel like too much. There's all sorts of things that are going on in people's relationships. So those numbers don't mean anything. What means something is, are you satisfied with how often you're having sex, being intimate? is your partner satisfied with how often you're intimate or having sex? And the reason why I'm saying being intimate is because a satisfying sex life isn't just about sexual intercourse. There are a lot of aspects about intimacy, and it's important to have conversations about it, because how do you and your partner define what it means to be intimate? Because sometimes I think, especially when people are busy and they're preoccupied with work or they're preoccupied with family responsibilities, and you've been in a relationship a long time and you've moved through the honeymoon period, there can be this mindset about, let's just have sex, let's just get this over with, and this is what sex is. And you can miss out on other aspects of intimacy and being together that don't necessarily include sexual intercourse. Now, going back to frequency, oftentimes the amount of sex that is happening in a relationship is driven by the partner who has lower desire for sex. It's not typically the other way around, where the partner who has the higher desire for sex is the one that is determining how much sex is happening. Now, regardless of how close you and your partner are to desire, there's often a difference with where one person wants to have sex more often than the other person. Now, sometimes that gap is way bigger, which can make a relationship very difficult. And I've got a fabulous book if you feel like, oh, that's me and my partner. Our sexual desire is on other sides of the room. It is so different. I've got a great book for that, because that can really impact the quality of your relationship when your desire levels are not matched or aren't close. Oftentimes, for a relationship to be satisfactory, the person that has the lower desire has to have sex with their partner more than they typically want to. And the higher desire person in the relationship often has sex less than what they want to. And when both partners are making that compromise, the relationship becomes more satisfactory. And here's why. The higher sex person feels valued and validated because their partner is having sex with them more frequently. And that in turn shifts the dynamic in the relationship and creates a situation of feeling loved. Now, this was a real eye-opener to me when I learned about this. For some people, desire does not come before arousal. And this really matters, because what that means is, in an act of intimacy, people that have arousal first don't even necessarily want to have sex or are thinking about sex until they start being aroused, which means they start actually engaging in some type of intimate act. This is different than people who have desire first and then arousal. So people that have desire first are thinking about sex or wanting to have sex before anything is starting. And I think society-wise, I think this is kind of the expectation and the norm. This is what we expect, that people have desire first and then arousal and then the act of intimacy. So for people that don't have that, for people that have to have arousal before desire, you can feel broken and you can feel like there's something wrong with me. There's something that is inherently wrong with me because I don't think about sex, and I should be thinking about sex because I love my partner. And it has nothing to do with how much you love your partner. And I just want to repeat that, because I think a lot of times people feel like if they don't want to have sex, it means that they don't love their partner, or they can't understand why they're not thinking or wanting to have sex because they know how much they love their partner. And this is something that is really worth having a discussion about and a personal investigation about, is where do I fall? Because that little piece of information, that desire might come after arousal, can completely change your sex life. And the reason for that is if you all of a sudden understand that about yourself, you know that you have to actually engage in intimate behaviors to get a sense of whether or not you really want to. See, you kind of just have to go for it. Now, this is a really big deal if the male in the relationship has to have arousal before desire, because it goes against our expectations and our societal norms. And it is more common in our society for men to be sexually frustrated than it is for women. So it's a double whammy when the male partner, if there is a male partner, but when the male partner has to have arousal before desire because they're not thinking about sex and the world has told them their whole life that they should be thinking about sex. So it can really impair their relationship because they think something's actually wrong with them and they're not. They're just different. I remember hearing or reading in one book that it's something like 50% of the population is arousal desire rather than desire arousal. So it's split. So the chances that somebody in a partnership is going to be like that is pretty great. Or and this is why it's so important to talk about it and to talk about your sex life, because it gives you an understanding of where the other person is. And some couples are definitely the same. They're both desire and then arousal, and their desire for sex is more closely matched. That makes it easier in a relationship, especially if they're communicative, but everybody has stuff that they have to work through. And if you've been in a relationship long enough, you know that it just comes with the territory that you're going to have to work at things and you're going to have to talk about things. And if you think back to when you first started being intimate with your partner, think about the energy that you put into those times of intimacy. Did you think about how you looked? Were you thinking about what underwear you were wearing? Were you trying to set the mood? Were you thinking about music? Were you thinking in the day, is this going to happen? Oh, I'm excited. I'm looking forward to it. And were you putting energy towards that? And is that different than you are now? Do you just kind of show up and you're in bed together because it's bedtime? And that's all the thought that you've got? I'm highlighting that because there's such a thing as maintenance sex, which is that you show up and you have sex because you're both there together and there's not a lot of effort and it's not a special occasion. That has its place in a relationship because not all moments of intimacy are going to be special events. But one of the ways to increase the spiciness of your sex life is to have times that are special and to have times that are maintenance. It's about balance. It's about thinking about it and being intentional about it so that it is more satisfying and more exciting. I read a lot of books this past few months about infidelity and about keeping things interesting in the relationship, because one of the things that appeals to people about the sex that they have with affair partners is the excitement level. And we already talked about that honeymoon phase. Well, that happens in an early relationship. So sex with an affair partner is different chemically in our body than it is with our partner because of the infatuation. And you can't recreate that honeymoon phase chemically later on, is my understanding. And I'm, again, not a sex therapist, so I'm not entirely sure if that is accurate. I'm talking about personal experience. But what I do know is that you can spice things up. So I have a 24-hour sex challenge. It's not as crazy as it sounds, but I've been told it's still pretty intense. I'm very goal-oriented, so I had this idea after reading these books about infidelity, like, oh, how can we make our sex life exciting, and what can we do to inject some intensity and some passion into it? If you want to get in on this challenge, send me a DM and I will get you that freebie because it'll do the things that we've been talking about. It is a requirement to have conversation because that's the first step of the challenge. And I'm not going to go into it very much, but it's an excellent way to spice up your sex life and to get you communicating with your partner, and also just to have some fun and be ridiculous because it is a bit of a ridiculous challenge. But it's one of those things that can set the course back towards a satisfying sex life. And I just want to put this out there. That challenge is not for the faint of heart. And if your relationship is really struggling or your sex life is really struggling, it may not be the best place to start. It might not quite be the right challenge for you. But reach out to a couples therapist, reach out to a sex therapist, because your relationship, as I said, changes. And sometimes we need more help than we can get from inside the relationship. But that doesn't have to be a long-term thing. Sometimes if we just spend the time investing and connecting about stuff like that, we can make a change. So I would encourage you to reach out to a professional in your work community, because this podcast is for entertainment and I'm sharing my experiences. I'm not sharing professional advice. Thank you for tuning in today. If it's uncomfortable for you to talk to your partner about sex, maybe listen to this episode again with them as a way to open the door towards communication. And if you know of a friend of yours that is struggling, please share this episode with them if you know they're struggling in their sexual relationship, because maybe there's something here that can be the beginning of change, which is really what the Art of Plenty is all about. It's about flipping on a light, creating a little bit of hope so that we can live the lives that we were meant to be living. And for me, that means having a healthy relationship with my husband, and sex is a part of that. Thanks for tuning in. This is The Art of Plenty, and I'm Amy McInnes.